Hi, my name is Josh Marston, and I'm the writer and director of Maria Full of Grace. This is the moment that every independent director looks forward to, actually getting to pontificate about the movie that they spent years making. This is 5 years in the making, this project, and it's really feels like it's taken a good long 5 years. 5 years ago, I wrote the first draft of this script, and I wrote the first draft of the script in 48 hours of insanity. I got this idea for the script based on something that I had heard about in relation to drug muling called shotgunning. And that's the very common practice of sending not one but a handful of drug mules on a given flight, knowing that one of them is bound to get caught. And that one that gets caught is probably going to create a distraction so that the others get through. And it's such a common practice that, in fact, sometimes drug traffickers will leak the identity of one of their drug mules in order for the others to get through. And so I had this idea, this concept, basically, of, 4 or 5 characters on a plane where they're all under the same circumstance and sort of reliant on each other, but also a little bit at odds, knowing that one of them is going to go down. And I started to make a few notes about the script and then immediately just sort of got sucked into it and started writing, and 2 days later came out the other end. I mean, I literally couldn't stop writing. Once I got the characters up in the plane, I didn't want to take a dinner break because I felt I'd left them up there. And the goal of writing this was partly because I got this amazing hook, but also because I had been following what was going on in the drug war for many years and had been interested in world politics and been reading about Colombia and knew that Colombia had been going through a 40-year civil war, and that there were guerrillas fighting paramilitaries, and that there was an insane drug trade. But also because I have my own personal obsession and fascination with immigrant stories. Perhaps because, like most Americans, my great-grandparents were immigrants, and also because I've traveled a lot. And so, it's this thing of mine that every time I meet someone with the slightest bit of an accent, I end up asking them, where are you from, and why did you leave where it was that you were, and what was it like coming to the United States for the first time. And so living in Brooklyn and spending time in Queens, I had a lot of conversations with Colombians and the experience of Colombians having to leave their country and start a new life in the United States. And so when I got this idea for this hook, it was an opportunity not just to tell what seemed like was going to be this amazingly fascinating story, but also a way to do something about the drug war and the consequences of the drug war, which my own politics are that I don't think that the drug war is effective and that it is leading us down the wrong road as far as trying to stop the drug trade and the drug problem. And I wanted to do a piece that got at that and then also showed what, it was like to live in the United States as an immigrant, and do it in a way that was compelling. Well, I wrote this first draft of this script in 48 hours in this incredibly short amount of time, thought it was amazingly tense, and then took a day off and sat back and read the script, and lo and behold, it was not that tense, and the drama had been overextended, and, I had all this information about the drug war, which I had sort of crammed in various speeches and extended dialogue, and that really started this long 3-year process of developing the script that was ultimately shot and which is now Maria Full of Grace. I very quickly realized that you can't really make a polemical film. You got to do something that's really through the eyes of one character and make it absolutely compelling from a character point of view. We arrive at what was originally the opening scene. This shot of Maria and Juan kissing was originally my first image of how the film should open up. It was, right up there on the first paragraph of the first page of the script, Juan and Maria kissing. And the goal of the scene, obviously, is to show Maria as this very determined young woman who wants something else and is sort of bogged down by a lot of things, one thing being this boyfriend who's just kind of a loser and kind of a drag. And make it visual and dramatic by having her scale this wall. We shot the scene and then we edited it in, we had it at the beginning of the film, and something about it it didn't quite work right up at the top of the film, and there we re-edited with Lee Percy the second editor. There were two editors on the film, and with Paul Mazzei, the producer, and we sort of reconfigured things to do the opening title sequence, which you saw, which was originally all part of the later plantation scene, and put this a little bit deeper in. The wall that she's actually scaling is a wall that we had to build. I became sort of obsessed that the wall had to be just high enough that it was actually a challenge for her to climb, but not too high that it would seem, impossible to do. And Catalina Sandino was determined to actually climb it herself. And so we had a rock climbing expert, and we had all this rigging just in case, and she climbed it several times, and at a certain point used some rigging, and Becky Glebczynski, the line producer, had this brilliant idea of using a perfectly blue safety line which could be removed later on, thank goodness. So Paul Mazzei, the producer of the film, who I just briefly mentioned, is probably the most significant collaborator I had in doing the film. He came on about a year into my writing process. We had known each other briefly in film school and then lost touch with each other, and then just a testament to the process of making independent film. It was by pure coincidence that a common friend happened to be on a train with him. And my friend said, "My girlfriend's roommate, I think, has a script that you might want to read." And so I got back in touch with Paul and sent him the script, and he read the script within a week and called me up and said, I read the script, I really like it. There are some things we should talk about, about character and whatnot. And then we couldn't help ourselves, just right there on the phone. We ended up getting into this 45-minute long conversation about Maria and Blanca and the arc of the story. And after having had producers vaguely interested, asking, could the film be done in English? What if Maria's family had had a governess and they all loved practicing their English? I mean, it was just absurd, the suggestions I'd been getting from producers. So it was an absolute pleasure to have Paul get it, really understand what I wanted to do from the start. And I knew that he understood my vision, and he was there to protect that vision and to make it come to the screen. We spent close to a year showing the script around before HBO Films came along, read the script, and thought the fact that it was in Spanish was one more thing that made it an interesting project. That's the amazing thing about HBO, is that they're always looking to do groundbreaking, interesting work. Colombia, I found out shortly after writing the first draft of the script, is the second largest producer of roses in the world. They're second only to Holland, Ecuador being a close third. When I found that out, it was something I knew nothing about, and I had no idea what the process of growing roses was, industrially speaking, and got very interested in the idea that Maria would work in a rose plantation. Economically, it's very important for Colombia. A lot of people actually come from other parts of the country to get a job in the rose industry. Filming this actual scene was a nightmare. It was the second day of shooting. We were just gelling as a crew, and the challenge of this scene is that this is a real operating rose plantation, and we had 114 women who actually work doing this job for a living, and the plantation was actually functioning while we were filming. By virtue of who we were, we had to pay for all the roses, which meant that we bought 18,000 roses. And we were shooting all day. Well, what you don't realize is that roses actually don't last that long when they're not refrigerated and it's a warm environment. And so shooting this scene was a nightmare, because every time we turned around, the roses started wilting. And then, just as we're beginning to fall behind in the day, it starts to rain. And the roof of the plantation is made of tin, and it's this incredibly loud, raining, drizzling sound. And it's the second day of the shoot. It was insane. I swore that my next film was going to be 3 people in a house with no extras. Dramatically speaking, one of the interesting things about this scene that was important in the writing process was that Maria is not the best worker. She's not perfect. She's clearly got some motivation problems, and this supervisor has had problems with her before. It was important to me that the supervisor was not just this ogre, and that it was not a black and white scenario. Working in a flower plantation is very difficult, often terrible work. Besides being on their feet for long periods of time, workers are exposed to all these different chemicals. The pesticides come off on their hands and irritate their skin and their eyes. All things no one ever thinks about when Mother's Day or Valentine's Day rolls around. Yet at the same time, in the past 20 years, plantations, relatively speaking, have gotten a lot better and are a steady source of employment. So I wanted Maria's work to be clearly oppressive, but at the same time, there has to be the suggestion that she is also the source of some of her own problems by virtue of her rebellious nature. Casting the film was huge. Finding Catalina was this enormous discovery for me. I always had this image of her in my head, and the fantasy is always that your actress is going to walk through the door and you're going to know, and it's going to be love at first sight. And the reality was that we spent 3 months looking at 800 girls in Colombia and Ecuador and in the Colombian communities of the United States, in New Jersey and New York and Miami, doing open calls, and in Colombia going to small towns, all around Bogota. We had a team of people who were going through small towns with a megaphone on the car and handing out papers outside of plantations and trying to get anyone who fit the age range and the type to come in and read for Maria, and we just weren't finding one. I kept rewinding tapes trying to convince myself that one or another girl that I'd seen was right. We finally got to a point after 3 months where we had to postpone the shoot, and I was really depressed, and I was thinking, what are we going to keep delaying by a week, every week? What if we never find her? And the next morning, another tape came from Colombia, and Catalina Sandino was the first person on the tape. And I knew within 30 seconds that it was her. It was instant. It was like recognizing an old friend. She was Maria. She was incredibly fresh, and she did every improvisation differently, but always understood the motivation, and if there was a direction, she got it, and she just was Maria, and it was this huge, huge relief. The team that was going out into small towns at one point went into South Bogota and went to a high school, at which point they found Jenny Paulo Vega, who plays Blanca, who is sitting here next to Maria. And Jenny had never acted before in her life. She'd never even been in a high school play. She always tells a story that, she was in her physics class when they showed up one day, and all of her friends had to convince her to audition, and she's just incredibly natural. The fiesta scene that we're looking at, for me, is a sort of triumph, for the whole crew. We had to shoot in Ecuador because of the political situation in Colombia. It was just too dangerous, and it was just before the elections in Colombia. We had intended to shoot in Colombia. We were going to do it with a small crew, but at the end we weren't able, and so we brought from Colombia to Ecuador all the actors as well as various creatives, including Monica Marulanda, who is the production designer for the first half of the film. And she was in charge of making this small town called Amaguaña, just south of Quito in Ecuador, into Colombia. And even though Ecuador is, bordering on Colombia and is another South American country and right next door, it looks very different. You would be amazed. Colombia has very specific colors. And there's a real tradition of painting their houses, all these wonderful different shades of pastels. And in Ecuador, for some reason, it just hasn't caught on. And where the cinder block is sort of a rose color in Colombia, it's all gray in Ecuador. So we really had to figure out the palette, and we had then to go to all of the owners of various homes, like all around the plaza, and offer them a little bit of money and pay their houses. And everyone was sort of scratching their heads as we were doing it in a couple weeks before we were shooting, going, why would anyone want their house this color? And then we were there for a couple weeks shooting, and all the people were great. And then when we went back after we were done shooting, and we were saying, okay, well, we're here to paint your house back to the way it was, people were like, well, actually, I kind of like the way my house looks. And I think only one person wanted their house painted back. The other thing about this scene is that Jim Deneau, the cinematographer, did this amazing job of lighting. It was a big pre-light. We had a great Ecuadorian crew, and they hung a lot of lights on poles and put things in houses and on roofs so that we could shoot in 360 degrees. We got here that night, and we were shooting in every direction, and it was just incredibly liberating, and Jim was great at doing that at various points. And a lot of the people that you're seeing in the background are people who actually lived in the small town of Amaguaña, and they all showed up on this Friday night to see what it was we were doing, and instantly became our extras. But of course, by 2 a.m, they had all gone off to sleep, so we had to be really careful about shooting in a certain order so that when we got into the close-ups, we could kind of contain, and have the few extras that we had arranged on in advance to be there for the background. But the people of Amaguaña were amazing. I mean, it was really wonderful to work in this little town and to be able to bring some money into the economy. I'd walk down the street and people would recognize us and come up and ask if they could be extras in the film because they were just so excited to have us there. shooting in Ecuador, of course, one of the issues for me was, how do we maintain Colombia? How do we make sure that we maintain the authenticity of Colombia? And how do we get the background of what's going on in Colombia into the film? One of the ways was through a little news report that's coming up right here that we faked.
Juan.
Which is just like this incredibly subtle thing that probably no one gets, but it's this little news report about the paramilitary activities in Colombia. Going back to the visual style of the film, this was a huge revelation. This was like the fourth day of shooting, and we were at the end of the day, and we were running out of time, and I just said to the actors, we didn't rehearse, I just said, go across the street and buy yourself an arepa. And they did it, and Jim Deneau followed them with the camera, and we had done a lot of handheld before that, but this was like this incredibly liberating moment where he just followed them. And after we were done shooting, I was like, that's amazing, that's okay. The rest of the film was all handheld, and it was a huge insight. And then we saw the dailies, and it made us seasick. We almost couldn't watch it, and we had to sort of do a little bit of cutting in order to make it watchable. But that was a huge part of the aesthetic of the film with Jim, was finding a sort of loose documentary feel that was handheld, but that didn't get in the way of the film at all. The scene between Maria and Juan where they're breaking up was so thoroughly enjoyable to do, and part of it had to do with the way that Catalina and Wilson Guerrero, who plays Juan, and I all worked together. Generally, what I did was, when I cast all the actors in Colombia, I gave them all the script, the first half of the script, up until the point in which Maria gets onto the plane. I gave them all this first half for 24 hours, and I said, okay, you can read it as many times as you want, and you have to give it back to me. And then when we saw each other again about 3 or 4 weeks later in Ecuador in pre-production and started rehearsing, we started doing a lot of improvisations. And the idea was that because they'd only read the script once or twice, 3 or 4 weeks before, they would be not so attached to their specific lines. And so we would meet every day and do scenes, and I would say, you remember that scene, more or less, when Maria and Juan have the fight and they end up breaking up? And then they would do an improv. And we would do like 3 or 4 improvisations. And they would come up with all sorts of interesting stuff. And then we would sit and open the script and read what I'd written. And then I'd hand them a pen and we would just rewrite the scene based on things I had written, based on things that they came up with. And what that did was, because I'm not a native Spanish speaker, it made sure that the Spanish that they're speaking is not only correct, but it's colloquially specific to the region of Colombia that these characters are from. And it also gave them a certain amount of ownership over their characters, because they were making choices about how they spoke and what was important to them and the way they would turn a phrase. And then beyond that, they would just come up with wonderful little bits of dialogue and ideas. And it just created this incredible amount of life, I think, for the characters and for the scenes.
Dígame cuántos meses, cuántos días pasarían antes de que usted se acostara con otra vieja.
María, eso no va a pasar.
Mire, Juan, yo no quiero que me pase lo que le pasó a mi
And
hermana.
this is one of my favorite scenes. I mean, I just love the way it sort of escalates on its own and gets out of control on its own and then ends up with them breaking up. I mean, I always knew that they had to break up at the end of the scene, and so it was sort of a question as to how I was going to get it there. And Wilson Guerrero and Catalina were both just great as far as getting that scene there, and it was just a pleasure to work with both of them.
Usted es un guache, Juan. Usted es un indio.
Es que no sé ni por qué me la aguanto. Muchos tipos se hubieran largado, María.
Ah, pues no lo haga.
One of the pieces of dialogue that didn't make it into the scene was Juan asks Maria, well, you're not thinking about getting an abortion, are you? And she says, I don't believe in that.
Perfecto.
It didn't make it into the cut because the scene was so long, because there was so much wonderful stuff in there, but it was important to sort of convey this sense, both that she is religious, but that she is not incredibly religious, but that she's got a certain number of values, so that you get to this scene here and she's looking at her sister and her sister's baby, and it's just that you get this sense of a real conflict that's going on in her head. And then we get to John Álex Toro, who plays Franklin, who's riding up on his motorcycle here, who she danced briefly with at the fiesta. John Álex was just a pleasure to work with. I mean, he was really, really great. He's one of the only actors in the film who has really significant acting experience. He's a regular on a Colombian show called Francisco el Matemático.
¿Qué más?
What was great about working with John Álex Toro is that he always had ideas, and he was always helping and always sort of prodding things along. We're about to be on the motorcycle with them, and Ecuador had certain limitations shooting, and one of them was rigs, and we just didn't have a rig to put a camera onto a car to film moving shots on a highway, and Jim Deneau started sketching designs for a rig on napkins, and the Ecuadorians welded this thing to the truck of the Ecuadorian producer that we started to refer to as the Pochomobile. It was just this amazing testament to the way the crew worked together. Getting back to John Álex here, and the whole thing about them creating their characters, you know, I was interested in the rose plantations, and I decided that I wanted to set the story in just the outskirts of Bogota where there are all these rose plantations. But then someone said to me, well, that's not a town that's known for drug muling. This town, Santa Rosa de Cabal, and Pereira, which is where Franklin's from, is where it's really known specifically to come from. And so that began a whole dialogue of, you know, well, maybe the character Franklin shouldn't be from her town. And John Álex really was actually from that small area of Colombia. And so, again, he just brought all of that, of his own upbringing, into the character and knew the area. The dominant perception of Colombia is the country where all the drugs come from. But there's another story underneath that, which is that it's the result or part of the cause. It's all intimately related to the fact that there's been a 40-year civil war going on there, and you have left-wing guerrillas mostly in the south, but in a lot of other parts of the country, and then right-wing paramilitaries, and then somewhere in the middle, the government that claims to be neutral but in fact has links to the paramilitaries. And both the paramilitaries and the left-wing guerrillas rely on the drug trade in order to make money to then buy guns. And then you have the United States government, which is ostensibly helping by passing legislation like Plan Colombia under Clinton in 2000 and then Bush later on, which is sending aid down to Colombia. In 2000, Plan Colombia was for $1.3 billion over the course of 3 years in aid to Colombia, and made Colombia the largest recipient of military aid from the United States, the first largest in the Americas, third largest in the world. And the problem is that over 90% of the money that's going down to Colombia is being used for military hardware. Mostly a lot of helicopters and a lot of advisors going down there, and then, of course, not coincidentally, the helicopters are made by American companies, so the senators who are voting for this aid are actually seeing the money come back to their own states where the helicopters are made, and everyone sort of has this nice, convenient interest, except for the people who are living in Colombia. One of the goals of the film is to ask, who is a drug mule? What is it that propels a person to make this incredibly risky decision? The idea is that by telling a drug story from the point of view of the person on the bottom, you begin to humanize who the drug mule is, and you realize their problems are economic and social, and that the solutions are economic and social, not military and criminal. So if there's one thing that this film can contribute, I hope, it's a small step toward understanding that the drug war is not working, and that we need to radically invert the way we're spending our money to fight the drug problem. I should just point out here that the images that you're seeing, this one, for example, all these POV shots, it's the little bit of footage we were actually able to shoot in Colombia. It was a great pleasure to actually get Colombia footage into the film. This location, the pool hall, comes from, you know, a conversation I had with someone who had been a drug mule. Question obviously is, well, how do you get sucked into this? And he told a story about going to a pool hall, and the locations person in Ecuador, Roberto Aguirre, found this wonderful pool hall that had this little space up in the corner. It just had exactly the feel of what I was imagining. The other thing that came out of a lot of these conversations that I had with former drug mules in doing research for the script was time and time again that the drug trafficker, the drug lord, as it were, is not your stereotype of what you get in Miami Vice or, you know, the typical cop stories. But in fact, they frequently talked about that the person who set them up was this very nice, kind, well-dressed, sort of paternal figure who was there showing interest in the problems that they had and offering a hand and wanting to help them out. And so I was interested at every turn, this one being an important one, in sort of changing the dominant perception of what Colombia is, what drug trafficking is, and understanding it in a more intimate and realistic way. The person who's playing the drug trafficker is Jaime Osorio, who also happens to be the co-producer on the film. He was someone that we got in touch with when we first went to Colombia, Paul and I, and he is a filmmaker in his own right, very well known. He was nominated for an Oscar for a film he directed called Confessing to Laura, and is the most incredibly generous and talented producer and filmmaker that I could have imagined working with. And he was what made the film possible in South America. And we had been looking for someone to play this character for quite some time, and it was days before we were supposed to start shooting. And I finally insisted that he put himself on tape. And it still wasn't clear to me. Maud Nadler at HBO was the one who said, "Josh, you're crazy. This is it." Ironically, what makes him so good at this scene is that as a producer, one of the things he's doing all the time is sitting across the table from people, interviewing them. And he just sort of brings that to bear in this. And he is a very paternal man and very warm. And that's exactly what I wanted to go for in the scene. And again, he and Catalina and I worked at sort of improvising and inventing all sorts of things for this scene. It was just really critical to me, you know, this turn right here where he begins to explain how things are going to work. What you don't get if you don't speak English is this reference to New Jersey. You show it to an American audience and they all laugh at that little point, you know, because here's this person who is knowledgeable and is in charge of everything and makes this little mistake, but Colombians who haven't been in the United States don't know any better, and it's kind of a funny little difference in the way two different audiences see the film.
¿Y cuánto me van a pagar por hacer eso?
Bueno, nosotros generalmente
The notion of giving someone money in advance is, again, something that came up in a lot of the conversations that I had with people who had done this. It's another one of these aspects. Rather than showing explicit violence in the film and having people pointing guns at people's heads and saying you have to do this, what gets people mired in the drug trade is a much more subtle level of manipulation combined with economic need and desperation. And it was very important to me all up until this point in the film to set up a situation where Maria's circumstances are clearly desperate and she's in very bad straits economically, but it can't be that she doesn't have any other option. It can't be that she's so economically desperate that she has to do it, because otherwise her decision would be sort of predetermined, and it wouldn't be any real decision at all. And, you know, one of the few things that I learned in film school was this sort of truism that character is created through action and through decisions that the characters take. And so in order to define Maria, you know, the most significant decision she makes is to go as a drug mule. It has to be a real decision. She could have gone to Bogota, she could have been a maid, but she chose this route, and it's not only out of economic desperation. You know, the economic necessity is necessary, but it's not a sufficient explanation. There's only like 40% of Colombians who are living on $1 a day. You know, there's a lot of poverty. There's 15 to 20% unemployment in Colombia. It's not a good situation, but you don't have all of those people going as drug mules. So the question immediately becomes, well, what does cause someone to be a drug mule? And talking to people who've done it, the drug traffickers aren't going and recruiting people out of the gutters. They're looking for people who have a motivation. They are, you know, maybe middle-class people who have slipped a little and they want to get back to where they were, or someone who has a dream of owning their own house. And for Maria, it's getting out. And that became really crucial, so that it's not just a movie of the week about a poor, desperate girl who has to do this. There's a certain level of individual decision.
Salió del bar, ¿verdad? Yo me llamo María.
Juliette Lopez is a phenomenal actress and just has the most riveting eyes. And we worked a lot on the glances in this scene. I had a very specific idea of when and where I wanted who to look at whom, you know. And we went over it various times, and they delivered, and the chemistry between them, I think, is great. For me, what makes Juliet interesting is that she seems to have this whole other story behind her eyes. You get this sense that things haven't gone well for her, even though she's nicely dressed, and that she's got other things weighing on her mind. And they're sort of hinted out further along in the film as well. But she was really a pleasure to work with, and she and Catalina worked really well together, I think. I remember the first rehearsal that we had with Andrea Mora here, who plays the sister, and with Virginia Risa, who plays the mother, and Catalina. And we started off just talking about the characters, and it naturally escalated into one of their sort of typical family fights, and it was great because they immediately understood who their family was. Maria's house was this house that we found in the hillside outside of Amaguaña, a tiny town where we were shooting. And the people who were living there were nice enough to move next door while we shot, and we repainted it and then dirtied it up and then got a lot of props from other people in the town. People opened up their homes to us and were very happy to have us, quote unquote, rent props so that it felt lived in and it felt really like a house. And then Monica Marulanda, again, the production designer, brought all these wonderful elements to bear. The plant hanging from the ceiling in the background, I don't know if we'll see it again, is very typical. And then if you listen to the production design under here as she goes into the room, there's very slightly this sort of underwhelming kind of thing that we worked on with the sound designers and the mixer to create this sort of tension at these key moments. Sort of a deeper, bassier, more creative sound design. Lucy is important, you know, in the story, obviously, to teach Maria. You know, American audiences, they see the grape thing and their jaws drop over a little bit. In Colombia, everyone has heard about swallowing grapes, interestingly enough. And it's the way in which people practice. I was told all sorts of stories, you know, that you start with grapes. You might freeze the grapes, and then someone who I spoke to talked about using pellets full of flour, and then, of course, the key thing is that you swallow the pellet full of flour, and you have to see how long it takes to come out, and see what it looks like, and figure out if the pH balance and the acids in your stomach are such that your body is going to deal well with this.
No puede comer nada 24 horas antes del viaje. Su estómago tiene que estar completamente vacío.
The preparation process is a long one and not a fun one, obviously. And there was one particular story of a guy who couldn't swallow them. He got like 1 or 2 grapes down. He couldn't get any of the practice pellets down. And he was really, really nervous when it came time to do it. And that was definitely one of the things that I was thinking of as I was sort of working back through the script, this level of expectation.
Lleve ropa bonita. Nada escandaloso, que no vaya a parecer una campesina parental.
We worked a bit on the design of Lucy's apartment here, that it should feel empty, and that even though she's been able to do this twice and has gotten a little bit of money, that she's somehow sort of alienated or sort of floating away. She's not living with family. She's not got a lot of personal stuff around. And that's just sort of to, again, amplify this notion that everything's not what it seems. The apparent solutions are not going to be the perfect answers. Just for the record, Juliet actually does swallow the grape in this scene. I was very proud of her, and she was very proud of doing it. And of course, the story about her sister is setting up something for later on. I was very pleased with the way in which Juliet made this story very real to her. And again, we were working a lot on the glances and who glanced at who when.
¿Cómo es eso por allá?
What's America like? It's all straight is again beginning to get at that America's not what
Es
you
demasiado
thought it
perfecto.
might be, and begin to
Es recto.
look at our own country from someone else's point of view and begin to see the way it looked. This is obviously where things are, beginning to mount up for Maria, and this was the last thing that we actually shot in Ecuador, this scene, and there's more to this take that we didn't use, where Catalina goes on to really get quite emotional. I was just really interested in this level of fear and dread that she had already committed herself to something and wasn't sure that she was able to go through with it. When this scene comes up and Blanca says that she's going to go as a mule as well, you can sort of feel this movement in the audience and this sort of groaning that Blanca is starting to become the character that you love to hate a little bit. She's the pesky friend that's gonna get in the way. The relationship between them was something that happened organically in the screenwriting process. I was lucky enough to be able to go to the Sundance Screenwriters Lab with this script, and I remember very clearly a conversation I had with Becky Johnson who said, I want to talk about the dynamic between Maria and Blanca. And I was like, okay. And she began to talk about, Blanca's clearly the follower, and what does Blanca need from Maria, and what does Maria need from Blanca. And as a screenwriter, it was this wonderful moment where I realized that I had been doing something intuitively, and then it was all just about going back through and teasing it out and making it a little more clear what the relationship was between them. And Jenny and Catalina read the script, and they both keyed in immediately to what their relationship was. As actresses and just as human beings, they got along really, really well. So I think it was a pleasure for them to work together and to bring this relationship to life.
Ir hasta Chiquinquirá. María, usted no sabe hacer nada del trabajo de una oficina.
Writing the scene was really difficult because it was, what is she going to say to her parents that they're going to believe, that's not going to seem so far-fetched, but that's going to allow her to actually break away. I remember one person I spoke to who had traveled as a drug mule who said that he told his wife that he had business in the United States. He was going to help someone carry perfume samples. And then he told his mother something else. And then they both found out they'd been told different stories. And that was how his cover was blown. It's worth saying something about the music here. I love the music in this scene, and I love all of the composed music. Jacobo Lieberman and Leo Heiblum are two Mexican composers who were found for us by Lynn Feinstein, who's the music supervisor, who's also in Mexico. And Jacobo and Leo did just a marvelous job with the music. Some of the things that we talked about were creating music that was unresolved, that was somehow open and complex, yet simple in terms of orchestration. I knew that I wanted it to be very much guitar-based, but finding Jacobo and Leo was an extremely long process, and it came in very late because it was really hard for me to find composers whose work I was responding to, and they were such a pleasure to work with. And now we begin to get to the pharmacy scene, and this was a sequence that was on the books for 2 days and then had to be done in a day, and I wasn't sure how we were ever going to do it. Roberto Aguirre, the locations person in Ecuador, again found this marvelous location. I always knew that I wanted her to be swallowing in a room, a back room. I'd always imagined it upstairs. Maybe I have to do it in 2 different locations. And then he shows me this pharmacy, which is in a town next to Amaguani. It's got this door, this bizarre door that's like a toothpaste display. And it just so rang perfectly true for everything that I imagined about kind of this back world of where she's going to do this. And this scene has a little bit of a cheat here because normally in the process the pellets would have already been made, but I had heard so much about how the pellets are made, and I thought it was so important to show it visually that I had the character doing it here. And this guy is Colombian. His name is Victor, and he was someone that my props person, Juan Olmos, in Colombia found. And it just goes to show something about the drug culture and drug world in Colombia that, you know, I was concerned about, well, how are we going to do this? I'd read so much about it and heard about it. I'd never seen anyone do it. And it's like 6 degrees of separation only. In Colombia, it's not 6, it's 1. You know, Juan came back and he said, I've found someone who knows a lot about it. And Victor was a quote-unquote retired drug pellet packer. And he knew all about it, and we had a lot of meetings, and we talked about this machine, this press that he uses, and he came up with all the parts. And I kept saying to him all throughout, I was like, you know, we're going to have your face on screen. He's like, yeah. And I was like, you know, we're going to have your name in the credits. And I kept waiting for him to back out. And I told Juan Olmos, the props person, I said, you got to be the understudy. You got to get him to teach you exactly what he's doing because he's going to pull out. And he never pulled out. I couldn't believe it. We got him the airplane ticket, flew him to Ecuador, put him in a little hotel room where we were all staying in Ecuador, and he had all of the equipment that he needed. And then we needed him to make extra pellets for the remainder of this scene, and then also for all 3 girls for the New York portion. And so he sat in this little hotel room in Ecuador for 2 days straight. He was complaining that his back started to hurt him. And he had all this flour and all this stuff laid out, and the whole room was filled with drug pellets. And the maid came in at one point and saw all this stuff and got very suspicious, and we had to sort of calm them down. We would sit at dinner after shooting, and he would have all these stories about things he had seen in his days in the past. He claimed, of course, that his pellets had never killed anyone. None of them had ever opened it. He had a perfect record. And you couldn't help but wonder whether this was sort of what he was telling himself in order to make himself feel better about the notion that maybe someone might have died or definitely gotten arrested as a result of the pellets he had packed. I want to point out, this is done in one shot. It was very important to me that Maria swallowing be done on screen. And so John von Bergen, who did the special effects props, worked with someone from the French Culinary Institute and created an edible form of a pellet, which Catalina manages to swallow and had to swallow more than one of.
¿Cuántas llevo?
23.
But just getting back to the pellets, he had made all of these, you know, well over 100 pellets, and we thought we were going to be able to FedEx them back because we had FedExed one. And in Ecuador, FedEx shows up at your office and has to inspect what's put in the box and witness the sealing of it, and they refused to send over 100 of these fake pellets, even with a letter from customs. So then it was like, well, do we have someone carry them back on a plane? Do we have someone swap? And in the end, we had to throw them away, and we had to remake them again in the United States. The whole circumstance that Maria is in is sort of based on many conversations I had with many different people who have done this, and it's just phenomenal, the different stories that people have. Certain things come up again and again, like that you have this horrible taste of latex from the gloves, from the rubber, you know, after swallowing so many. And people always ask, well, is it true that she would swallow that many and they would be that big? They really are that size, and normally people swallow over 60, 80, 100, 110 of these pellets. So you get this terrible latex taste in your mouth, which brought up the idea of her brushing her teeth, which establishes the toothpaste for later on in the airplane, which she's going to use. But then also creates this moment where she looks at herself, and again, there's the sound design underneath here that creates this sense. She's looking at herself, I am a drug mule now. She's sort of crossed the line dramatically, and it's a very significant moment for her. And all of this, the giving the ticket and giving the cash, again, these were things where, from the conversations that I had had with people, were just these moments. She's never, ever had $800 of cash in her hand before. It's this huge sum.
Ese es el hotel y la dirección.
One final thing, I said that we had to compress this from 2 days into 1 day of shooting. That was in large part doable because of Jim Deneau's lighting. There was not a single light inside the space. It was all lit from outside in a really beautiful, soft way that allowed us to just keep moving around the room. And all of the props, all of the pharmacy stuff, it was all there in the location. And it was just this wonderful coincidence of great location, great lighting, great crew, and we just banged it out in a really short amount of time. I was always very happy with this shot. We came up with this once I saw the X-ray machines going behind. Jim Deneau loves shooting things through other things. I learned a lot about framing, a lot about coverage from Jim. We're getting into the airplane sequence, which is the heart of where the film always was imagined. And this moment of Maria closing her eyes, it's the idea of here's this girl, and this is the first time she's ever been off the face of the planet, the first time she's ever been in an airplane, and what is this like? And so that this is a story about not just drug swallowing, but all of these incredibly new and daunting experiences that she's going through. She's looking out the window, which is a shot we shot afterwards. As I say, the hook was originally 4 women in a plane. The idea is that one of them was probably going to go down so the other 3 can get through, and who's it going to be, and is someone going to rat someone else out? That quickly got reduced to make room for the much more compelling human drama. But because the airplane section was still going to be such a crucial part of the film, we knew, Paul and Jim Deneau and I and everyone involved, that we couldn't shoot this on a set, a fake airplane. It needed to be a real airplane because we needed to be able to see in every direction at any given point. And we contemplated shooting it in New York and tried to get a plane at JFK, but after 9/11 it was just insanely difficult. And Gigi Jaramillo and Pocho Alvarez and Altercine, the production staff in Ecuador, worked with the Ecuadorian Army or Air Force to get an airplane. They found this airplane which was scheduled to be rotated out of use in order to be serviced. We got it flown down to a military base in Latacunga, which is about 50 or 75 miles south of Quito. And we spent 3 days living on an airplane. Becky Glubczynski, the line producer, who was a marvel, who was the glue that held this film together, reminded me, or rather told me, I didn't even realize while we were shooting, that there was something like 8 people who had to be taken to the infirmary over the course of the 3 days we were shooting this because people were fainting. We had the whole crew, and we had 80 extras all in a real plane with one little corridor, and we were all on top of each other. But that was near the end of the shoot in Ecuador, and we were very cohesive and working very well together. We're gonna move into this scene here that is so brutal and graphic, and people say, come on, this can't be true. People don't really do this. But again, this is taken from stories of things that do happen to people. You can't predict what your body's gonna do. And I had heard stories of this happening, and you can't flush them down the toilet because you got to account for what you took with you, and you can't just put it in your pocket. And this is indeed what happens. The lavatory itself was shot afterwards. It was shot in New York. It's a set and is actually the work of Debbie Davila, who's the production designer for the second half of the film. And so there's this overlap between Monica Marilando's work and Debbie Davila's, and though it's this tiny little lavatory, it's this nothing thing, it was, I think, one of the most difficult sets for Debbie because she had to find a decent lavatory set. She then had to redress it and make it match this part of the scene, the airplane. And then, of course, the door opens and everything has to gel, and Debbie did a marvelous job. And now here again, a little sleight of hand. That was the real pellet with the latex, as is that. And then this, going by in an instant, is the edible pellet, which Catalina swallows. The little toothpaste on her lips is one of these little details that I love that just was completely unplanned. You know, I haven't really talked about Catalina's performance, but Catalina Sandino for me was just this incredible discovery, and I hope a discovery for the world. I mean, she had never acted in film before. She had done a little bit of theater. She had done sort of theater on the weekends as a theater student while she was in high school and into college. And we cast her and took her out of her life and put her into this huge machine, which was by American standards a small independent film, but it was a big film shoot, and it was a crew of 40, sometimes 60 people with, in this case, 80 extras, working in a small space and with all the demands that are put upon a professional actress. And she pulled it off time and time again, and I am forever indebted to Catalina for being able to do such a brilliant, brilliant job with Maria. And so now things are beginning to escalate, and you know, there are a number of scenes in the airplane that were taken out. This woman sitting next to her, there was a whole scene where they're eating and she's babbling in Maria's ear. Because eating is another thing on the airplanes. You know, there's so many details, it's just staggering. The common belief is that the stewardesses work for the DEA and that they look for people who are suspicious and they pass that information on in advance so that customs are waiting. And one of the things that they'll look for is whether or not people eat their food. The general assumption is you shouldn't eat because it will get your stomach juices flowing and it will cause your body to go to work on the pellets and have them disintegrate. One person I talked to was convinced that he should drink alcohol in order to look convincing to the stewardesses, so he ordered a whiskey, drank some of it, and then didn't want to swallow and managed to go back to the lavatory and spit it out, and then was really happy because he had alcohol in his breath and did that like 3 times. Of course, meanwhile, going back and forth to the lavatory is another thing that stewardesses look for. As I said, there were scenes in this sequence that came out. It could have been a lot longer. It was at one point in the first draft of the script a huge section. And then editorially with Anne McCabe and then Lee Percy, we narrowed it down. And I was still worried that it was going to play too long. But people find the tension unbearable, which is great. So now we're officially in North America shooting. This is JFK Airport, the British Airways terminal. We had a very short amount of time to shoot in this space. We had, I think, like 6 hours. And everyone did a phenomenal job, and there's a lot of extras. One of the things that made this shootable was U.S. Customs. I had talked to U.S. Customs while I was doing research for the script, and then when we got into production, they were pivotal in helping us get into the space. And then I worked with Catalina and with Ed Trucco and Selena Levis, who were the customs inspectors. And we worked with real customs inspectors to have them show us exactly what they would do, what kinds of questions they would ask, how they would pat them down. And, you know, the importance for me in this is, again, in the same way that I'm interested in telling a story that is different insofar as it's from the point of view of someone who's actually been a drug mule rather than the cop's point of view, and shading who it is that a drug mule is and bringing humanity and dimension to that character. I don't want to do so at the expense of all of the other characters. It's important that the customs inspectors not be these bad guys or these, you know, two-dimensional cops that are out to get her. And the thing that I learned in spending many, many days in research with the customs inspectors at Kennedy was that the huge issue for them, the huge watchword, is profiling. Customs has been sued by various people, class action suits, for racial profiling. Because, you know, the obvious thing is you would think, well, if you're going to look for someone carrying drugs, you're going to look on certain airplanes coming from certain areas, and then you're going to look for all young women, if that's what drug mules are. Well, as soon as you talk to customs inspectors, they immediately tell you, well, if we did that, then we'd miss 99% of drug mules, because the fact of the matter is they would catch on and they would just change all the time. So we have to be looking for everyone. And they are very vocal about saying that we look at everyone. Obviously, there's a sixth sense that they're employing to try and figure out whether someone is telling the truth or not. But their point is that they have a lot of safeguards now. And one of them is that to even get to this point where Maria is now being interrogated, you have to go through a lot of different stages of being questioned. Of course, for script reasons, I've condensed things. I allowed a male inspector to be even in the room while she's being frisked down, which is not something that would probably be done, or the door might be left open if that were being done. And there would probably be a third person in the room here. But one of the things that I am trying to be faithful to is this good cop, bad cop thing, which is something that more than one inspector told me that is a frequent practice, where the good cop is trying to play the friend, and say, come on, let me just help you out here. But talking to drug mules, I was mostly talking to people who were in prison, who had been caught, and so who had been through this process. And it's incredibly harrowing for them. And what you don't see is that the people who get caught, after they're x-rayed, they are taken to a trailer, at least in New York and Kennedy, a trailer that is on the premises of the airport, and they are shackled to a bed. It looks sort of like a hospital. And they are supervised 24 hours a day by customs inspectors, because like any other situation with drugs, the cop that busts them, who actually gets to see the drugs come out, you have to witness that the drugs were on the person who's being arrested. So, once you've been shackled to the bed and they're sort of waiting for the drugs to come out, when they say, I got to go to the bathroom, they're brought to a bathroom, the toilet that's in this trailer. And it's a very humiliating thing for the person who has to go through it, because the customs inspector watches the person going to the bathroom, and then the drugs come out, as it were, and don't go into a toilet. Obviously, they go into a contraption that immediately has jets that spray high-powered water at them and clean them off, and they trundle down a chute and go directly into an evidence bag. And every customs inspector that I spoke to said that they all work that trailer in rotation, and that is the worst. It's just as humiliating for them as well, that is not what anyone chooses to become a customs inspector to do, and that is one of the most awful parts of their job. That x-ray, by the way, it's just worth pointing out, that's an actual x-ray of a drug mule that was given to us by customs. They clipped off the name, but it was actually an x-ray of someone they referred to as a triple packer, meaning someone who had drug pellets in their stomach, inserted vaginally and anally as well. Yeah, you heard me right.
¿Sabes que estás embarazada?
People look at this and they question how Maria got through, particularly Colombians who watch this. They assume that customs inspectors are a lot meaner, and there's no way that she would have gotten off for being pregnant. Well, the line that just went by, we can detain you. The whole game here for these two is that customs can't x-ray a pregnant woman. They can detain her, but you can't detain every pregnant woman that goes through, because if you start detaining pregnant women that aren't actually carrying drugs, you've got a huge public relations problem on your hand, and you've got another class action suit. And it becomes a very difficult job for customs inspectors, who are genuinely trying to do their part in fighting the good fight and keeping drugs out of the country. So there's this moment, she's playing tough cop here. She's trying to take one last stab to see what the situation is, and they are now going to look at each other and they're going to try and make a determination as to whether or not it's worth running the risk of detaining a pregnant girl, and just how certain do they feel that she's what they call loaded.
Se lo juro.
The sound of those doors is so key, because you can feel a palpable sense of relief in the room. We move now into this next section, and we've got our two thugs. And once again, I would say that it was important to me that these guys not be a stereotype. It would have been very easy to make these guys just awful. and they clearly have to be menacing, but the interesting idea here for me was that they're young, and that by the end of it, you begin to get this sense that they might have been just as scared as the girls when they disappeared, because they were going to have to report to someone else. These two actors who had never acted before in their life, I think, just gave this very nice performance that was not over the top, and that was just really important. Maria is going to be sitting in a bathtub here. The reason for that is because you don't want to go in the toilet because it's second nature to flush. And of course, if you've just expelled a bunch of drug pellets and you accidentally flush, that's the end of your life, basically, and no one wants to run that risk. That smelling the pellet is just this lovely detail that Catalina did. The real feeling here that I was going for that was really important was this sense of claustrophobia. It's kind of ironic. These 5 young people in a room, in a hotel room, for several days on end, living on top of each other. And, you know, normally you imagine 5 young people in a hotel room. This is not what you picture. And it was very interesting to sort of think about all the details of what's going to happen, how much junk food is going to accumulate, what's it like for these people, how do they separate their drugs, how do they keep track of them. And the little detail here where Juan Porras is going to cross himself is in relation to a show on TV. You know, it's talking about, very low in the mix, there's an apparition of the Virgin Mary on the side of a tree, and he's watching this and crossing himself. That comes from having read this, you know, really interesting account of several kidnappings in Colombia. Colombia is the world capital of kidnappings. At the time we made this, there were like 3,000 kidnappings a year. It's now down to 2,200, but the kidnappers were very religious. I mean, there were these young guys who were very brutal and real thugs, and yet would talk about that they were doing this in order to get money, and that the first thing they wanted to do was buy their mother a house, and they were very Catholic, and they still believed, and they would cross themselves. And these are accounts related to people who are being held captive. And for me, the interesting thing about creating character is allowing characters to unfold in all of their complexity and all of their contradictions, and not trying to smooth those contradictions out, but seeing them instead as an opportunity to create a 3-dimensional character. One of the early things that I had read about and heard about in drug mules is that on a fairly regular basis, New Jersey police will find bodies by the side of the highway a mile or 2 from the airport, disemboweled. And when things go wrong, this is what happens. Sometimes people don't quite know, you know, the blood in the bathtub, what that signifies, but the idea is that Lucy died, and they did what they needed to do in order to retrieve the drugs. And then they were going to get rid of the body. And I was a little bit concerned at one point of like, well, is it really motivated that they would run off like that? Because, you know, well, it's just Lucy, it doesn't relate to them. And then we had a rough cut screening, and it was like, man, of course they do. And what they run off into is the wilds of New Jersey. And this is obviously like the first glimpse that they begin to get of America. And it was important to me that America not be the land of milk and honey, streets paved of gold, everyone white and in business suits, working in offices. You know, the first 2 people she runs into are this Filipino guy and a Haitian guy. And the struggle of what it's like to try and communicate and not have any English skills. Aside from authenticity, this was a basic reason as to why the film had to be made in Spanish, because if they had been speaking English all through the first half of the film and we had been pretending that it was Spanish, Then when she got to America, and she's still speaking English, and then they're also speaking English, you wouldn't have been able to tell which English was supposed to be Spanish and which was really English.
No, tranquilo, yo solamente quiero llamar.
It's okay, no problem. I take you, flat rate.
I love the fact that the first thing that she hears in this taxi is this guy speaking in Creole, and she can't understand what he's saying. And they're looking out in America, and the first thing that they're seeing are factories and smokestacks and a freeway that is taking them somewhere that they don't know. And the film never really goes into Manhattan. Maria gets this glimpse of Manhattan, and it's just from a car that won't stop and is just through a window. And then all of a sudden she's on another bridge and Manhattan is receding in the distance. And that was it. That was all she ever got. That's New York. And now it's leaving again, and she has no idea where she's going. And part of that had to do with the fact that another very important aspect of the research for this film had nothing to do with drugs at all. It had to do with all these conversations that I had just by virtue of living in Brooklyn and spending time in Queens with Colombian immigrants. And immigrants in general, but Colombians specifically. And one of the things that you realize living in New York is there's a whole lot more to New York than Manhattan. And it's very easy for someone who's not an immigrant to forget that. And that people live their whole lives in Queens, and there is a whole community in a place like Jackson Heights, and that this is someone's experience of America. It is what's referred to as Little Colombia, and Manhattan is just a skyline that's off in the distance that you occasionally see when you're on a subway platform waiting for the train to arrive. And so it was really important to create that sort of sense of distance and a little bit of sort of alienation. This scene is, of course, critical because this is where Maria and Blanca are going to separate. And I knew sort of dramatically I needed to get them apart, but it was a question both in the shooting and the scripting and then also in the editing of what to do with Blanca. This is a little detail. This woman's in an Indian sari.
Blanca, venga.
Every Colombian I spoke to says, what's your first impression of America? One woman was telling me, I'll never forget seeing some guy with a turban in the airport when I first arrived. I was waiting for my bag. I'd never seen an Indian in a turban. This is this other aspect of America. That was what was interesting to me to capture on screen that I feel is not captured frequently enough in a really, really realistic manner. So we've separated them, and we don't know where Blanca's going to go. And now it's definitely really hitting Maria, the gravity of everything that's happened. And for me, structurally speaking, for the screenwriters listening to this, this is what I would refer to as the end of Act 2. I mean, for all the things I'm trying to do that might be different, I can't claim that this script is anything other than a 3-act structure. And this is, for me, the end of Act 2. This is the lowest point that Maria is going to sink to. Everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. She is all alone, without knowing anyone here in New York. A couple details about the sound design, the soundscape here. We're trying to hear a few things going on from behind doors and begin to get the sense of families and lives. And there's a baseball game in the background there. And then that's going to change to a soap opera as the door opens and we move into Carla's house. And so now we come to this, doing what you would never otherwise do, introducing a whole new set of characters deep into the story. Introducing Carla, who's played by Patricia Ray, and her husband, Pablo, played by Fernando Vasquez. This was something that Fernando did, and I loved this, and I loved keeping it all in one shot. I love the framing that Jim Deneau gives and the little sliver of light. And in the script, it was that, the door opens, and lo and behold, here is this woman who looks just like Lucy. I don't know how much like Lucy Patricia Ray actually looks, but became really significant. You know, people read the script and said, oh my God, you've got this script that's got 4 really, really strong women in it. In some ways, a very feminist story about 4 women who are all trying to make their own way. And that happened very organically over the course of developing the script and then working with the actresses. But the really significant thing from a cultural point of view about Carla and her husband is getting inside of the experience of what it's like to be a Colombian immigrant in New York. And again, this comes from just all of my conversations with people and from living in New York. And there are 4 million Colombians living in the United States. It's 10% of the Colombian population that has left the country, and it is mostly people who have the means to get a visa and get themselves out of the country, so there's a real brain drain going on. And yet, the perception of Colombia, for very obvious reasons, is that it is the land of drug runners and drug traffickers. But of the 4 million Colombians who live in America, something like 0.3% of them have anything to do with the drug trade. 99.7% of Colombians in America have absolutely nothing to do with drugs. They are immigrants who are here, who are trying to create a better life for themselves, who are escaping a very untenable situation, and a lot of them thinking that it's provisional, that they will go back at a certain point. So that was very important to me to show. And part of it came out through the production design as well. And Debbie DeVille, again, did a marvelous job with Carla's apartment. But then also Patricia and Fernando. Patricia lives in America and is a professional actress living in Los Angeles, but of Colombian parents and grandparents, and grew up as a child in Jackson Heights, a few blocks away from where we're shooting. We shot all of this section in Jackson Heights. This is an apartment in an apartment building on 86th Street in the heart of the Colombian community. A lot of Colombians living in this building that were passing by us as we were shooting. And I think that Patricia clearly brought something to the role that had to do with her own personal connection to Colombia. It was important to me that everyone who was opening their mouth and speaking in Spanish ostensibly as a Colombian character was actually Colombian. This little thing of blowing up the little raft to sleep on comes from another immigrant story entirely, a Russian actor who came to the United States and worked as a Thai salesman, told me this marvelous story about the first 2 weeks he spent in the country living in someone else's apartment, sleeping on an inflatable swimming pool raft. And now the sound design is beginning to feel a little bit more of the street life of New York. The intention here is Maria's looking over her shoulder to figure out what's happened to Blanca. She hadn't intended to leave Blanca behind. And Carla is sort of whisking her off to the calling center. What's been omitted there in between is a scene of Maria having a nightmare. And that was intended to keep the drug story alive and to show her anxiety about what she's going to do with the drugs. She suddenly, in the nightmare, is 9 months pregnant and wakes up in the middle of the night. There's a knock on the door, and the 2 thugs are there, and they burst in, and they grab her and plunge a knife into her belly, and cascades of what look like drug pellets come out of her stomach, and she tries to catch them with her hands, and each one has a tiny fetus in it. I mean, it was this gruesome, surreal scene, and John von Bergen spent months making these small pellets out of this rubber with a hand-sculpted form of a fetus. We shot it, and it was an incredible shooting process, and then we cut it in, and it was such a different tone. I had a feeling that it might not work. I think we all had this sense that it was going to be different, but at a certain point there was no turning back, and it was quite a lot of fun to do, and it was definitely very interesting. Again, here getting a little bit of a glimpse of what Pablo does for a living. Is, working as a driver for a car service. And the music in the background here is Colombian Asilo 38, which is just a great band and a great soundtrack put together by Lynn Feinstein. This scene always elicits laughter and groans that Blanca has magically returned. And that she's found some place to stay on her own. And the key line for me in this scene is, what do you mean you don't know someone? Everyone in America knows someone. And that is, to a certain extent, true. Because of the situation in Colombia and because there's so many people who have left the country, everyone knows someone, except Blanca, who is going to lie and continue to dig herself deeper and deeper in. Again, this is this hallway in this building. In the heart of what we're now seeing is Jackson Heights and the Colombian community in Queens. And the man who's referred to as the mayor of Little Colombia, Orlando Tabone. This is Orlando. Orlando is a Colombian man who came to the United States 35 years ago and has a small travel agency. Beyond his work as a travel agent, his main thing is that he is the center point for a lot of the Colombians in the community. He's the person that you go to when, you're renting an apartment and you need papers that claim that you make a certain income, or you have someone back in Colombia who's gotten sick and you need to figure a way to get medication back to them, or you have trouble with your income taxes or your legal status. He's the person that people turn to and go to. He's the fixer in the community, and I think just about every immigrant community has their equivalent of Orlando. And I had already been working on the script for several years and was meeting with someone about financing when they said, well, this is a great script. Have you ever met the mayor of Little Colombia? And they told me about Orlando, and I called him up and set up a meeting and went out to go visit him. And told him about the project, and he was very, very passionate about supporting the project. He was, like most Colombians, very interested in doing something that would correct a misperception about Colombians and the image of Colombia. And he allowed me to spend a long time just sitting in his office watching like a fly on the wall all of what he did. And I became convinced that he was such an important personality in the community that there ought to be a character based on him. And so I went back and rewrote and created this character of Don Fernando that is inspired by Orlando Tabone. And when it came time to cast, he was just the obvious person. He's, among all the various works that he's done work also with drug mules. Something that I'll come back to in a moment when we come back to the second scene with him. The moment here where Blanca pulls out the drugs always just elicits this groan. It was important to me that he not just be this finger-wagging person who says, you got to turn those drugs into the police, because as a Colombian, he understands what the risks are to Maria's family. And that's the importance of that calling center scene a few scenes back where Maria's calling her family. Family is a very important tie, even though Maria is coming from a very difficult situation. She still has strong feelings about her family, and she's not going to do anything to put them in jeopardy. But of course, she's still very hard-headed, which is what's going to cause her and Blanca to have this fight. This is a scene that came about as a result of the Sundance Lab. After having that conversation about the dynamic between these two characters with Becky Johnston, I realized that this scene needed to be in here. And Maria storms off and in a rage starts to walk around the neighborhood. And dramatically speaking, this scene was very important to begin to try and make the segue from her fuming to beginning to see a little piece of this neighborhood that she's been in. That guy doing that with flowers is something that if you don't live in New York, I'll tell you that you see everywhere on the corner. People putting out roses, and this guy handing out little slips of paper all over this neighborhood is people handing out flyers. And this was intended to be a lot about Maria beginning to be aware that there is an environment out there and there is an interesting community. And I would have loved for there to be a lot more scenes of other immigrants walking around, because this is one of the things it's reacting to. A lot of Colombians they're very amused by the notion that you could buy what is called an oblea, this sort of wafer with arequipe, which is sort of caramel, that you could just buy it on the street in New York. And in fact, you can, because this is a Colombian community. And again, it's sort of underlining, reinforcing the notion that this is not by accident, by virtue of where Lucy's sister lives. She has ended up in a Colombian community. I knew what the ending was going to be. She was going to end up making a choice to stay in the United States. And part of that had to be, again, about reversing this notion of America is this big, bad, terrible, cold environment, that people are able to carve out moments of community. And one of the manifestations is, the food that you can buy on the street corner, and it's just sort of this little piece of home. And so it was important to set up that in order to justify Maria's decision at the end of the film.
Tiene que llenar este formulario.
Es importante que tenga mucho cuidado durante el embarazo. No debe fumar, no puede consumir alcohol, nada de cerveza, vino, mucho menos drogas. Todo lo que consuma.
This scene, of course, is one of the only scenes in the film where Maria smiles. And it was such a pleasure to shoot because of the naturalism of the performances here. And when we were editing the film, it was a funny thing that happened. Anne McCabe had a lot to do with a lot of scenes, like the fiesta scene and editing certain things. But then Lee Percy came on, and we continued cutting. We did a rough cut screening. And it was an odd thing because people had trouble enjoying the relief of this scene because they were waiting for this shot to be of a pellet deep in her stomach. And the editor said, I've never had this problem where you've got too much tension. And we actually did a cut where we reversed the order of some of the scenes so that we could close the whole narrative of having her deliver the drugs, so that this scene would play a little bit differently, so that you could actually not be distracted by the tension of what was going on with the drug story. In the end, we put it back to the way it was scripted. But the editor, Lee Percy, said that he had rarely encountered a situation in cutting where you had too much tension. It was an interesting problem to have. I liked this, in a script way, just this sort of subtle planting of the assumption that, of course, she will be staying.
Okay, está bien.
Orlando Tabone arrived here 35 years ago. By about 20 years ago, he was already a member of the community, and people were turning to him for help, and his phone rang one day, and it was someone calling him from Colombia. And they said, we don't know who you are. We're calling from Colombia. Someone gave us your name and telephone number and told you might be able to help, but our son traveled to the United States a week ago, and we haven't heard from him. We don't know what's happened to him, and we thought maybe you could help us track him down. Orlando made several calls and discovered the body of this young man in the morgue in New Jersey, and then went about calling the family and breaking the news to them, and then raising the money to have the body repatriated back to Colombia so that it could have a proper Christian burial. And it was very important to him as a Colombian that this be done properly and to help this family. He's a man with an extraordinary heart. And in the past 20 years, he has helped repatriate the bodies of some 400 people who have died as drug mules on their way to the United States. People who would otherwise have been buried in the Potter's Field in unmarked graves, people who would otherwise be forgotten. And one of the many, many incredible benevolent things that this man does for the community is this very unfortunate, sort of gruesome task of making up for the drug problem by repatriating bodies. This scene is, again, getting into the life of being an immigrant in New York from Colombia and what that's like. Obviously, the tension here is whether or not Maria is going to say the right thing and actually come out with the truth. I was talking about, justifying Maria's final decision, and I had written this script and we were already casting and had a preliminary conversation with Lee Percy at the time when we were considering working from the start together, and he said, I'm concerned about whether or not her decision to stay in the United States seems justified. And we were having a casting session, and I brought it up to a woman named Marcela Castaño, who was helping us with the casting of the film as we were just waiting one day for people to come in and do auditions. And I said, I'm concerned about justifying Maria's decision to stay in the United States. And she looked at me and she said, are you kidding? Of course, it's obvious why she stays. And I said, well, you tell me, why do you think she stays? The first thing she said, well, obviously for her baby. And then she began to tell me about her own experience and what it was like first getting to the United States. And she described being on a street corner on a payphone, calling back home when her grandmother was having a birthday, and the incredible pain of having her sister asking, what's it like? Is it wonderful there? All the stories that you're seeing in this monologue scene, I will be absolutely honest in saying, are taken directly from that conversation that I had with Marcela. And she came to tears in describing this to me. It was very important to her, these experiences, and I just put them right into the script. When we went to shoot it, we were shooting in this little apartment in a building in Jackson Heights, and we finally finished, and I walk out of the apartment, and out in the hallway is this Colombian man who's been watching on a monitor and listening through the open doorway, and he pulls me aside and he says, I just heard this scene. He says, I've never seen that put on screen before. You somehow captured this feeling of what it's like, this ambivalent feeling of being an immigrant. And he thanked me for putting it on screen. It was one of these unforgettable moments for me of feeling like, people say when you're directing, do you know it? Do you know when you've nailed it? And that was one of these great moments.
Encontraron el cuerpo de Lucy. Yo lo vi en una foto. Va a costar $2,500 enviar a Lucy a regreso a Colombia. Thinking
about Maria and her struggle to, what she has to do over the course of her story, and obviously the question of the film here is she going to do the right thing and tell Carla the truth of what happened? And this is one of the most difficult scenes to shoot, interestingly enough, because it's pretty unsympathetic to have Maria never able to tell the truth. And it came up in the middle of shooting. Maybe it's too unsympathetic. Maybe we need Maria to tell Carla the truth of her own volition without Fernando calling. I mean, I think that's a concern of, making this a little bit happier of an ending, that Maria was able to do the good thing, the right thing. And there was a lot of discussion. It was in the midst of shooting. And the compromise that Paul and I worked out was that the call should still come, but rather than having Carla hang up, as was originally scripted, Maria would interrupt Carla in the middle of the conversation and try and get the words out late, but not as late as it had been. And we had been shooting for days in this apartment, and everyone was exhausted. And at the end of the day before we're supposed to shoot this scene, I tell the actors, I know it's been a long day, but I really need you to stick around, and ask them to improvise. And I asked Catalina, I said, in this improvisation, I need you to tell Carla the truth earlier. And we did a couple of improvisations, and she couldn't do it. It was very difficult for her. It was hard to justify because it's hard for the character to do. And I went home and I thought about it and I rewrote the scene, showed up the next morning with new pages, and it was very difficult for everyone to make this adjustment. And we spent the whole morning shooting, and we started on Carla, and it wasn't working and it wasn't working. I couldn't figure out why, because I wasn't able to be in the room because it was such a small space. And then suddenly I realized, I listened to what Catalina was doing off screen and realized that she wasn't getting the scene, she wasn't feeling it. And we broke for lunch, and Paul Mazzei, the producer, was great and very supportive and said, Josh needs to do whatever he needs to do to get this scene. We can't walk away without it. And he had a long conversation with Catalina at lunch, and then I went on this 20-minute walk with Catalina as they were shifting lights. And we returned to set, and Catalina showed up a few minutes later with a smile on her face, and she had rewritten the dialogue slightly, made it her own. And we did a take, and she nailed it. And that was one of the happiest moments of the shoot. I remember Paul and I hugged each other. It was like we were just blown away by what she had done. And it was very difficult for Catalina. And it was, again, one of these examples of her professionalism of just coming through and making it work.
Está sonando. ¿Aló? Sí, es María Álvarez. Sí, yo estoy con ella.
¿De putas cree que iba con la mercancía? ¿Qué dijeron? ¿Te volaron perras
pero es que no
hijueputas?
está-
Pero nada, ¿dónde están las putas, Pepas?
Está entre...
A ver.
This parking lot scene, this was the last day of shooting of principal photography. And this was a difficult scene to shoot because we had rehearsed it a month earlier. And by the time we finally rolled around to shooting it, these guys who didn't have a lot of shoot days and hadn't been working a lot on the film, we got to the scene and we had lost the scene. We're trying to rehearse it, everyone's standing around watching me rehearse it, and it's very stressful. And here, I'm finally at the end of this long shoot, my first feature film, and I think, must have learned something by now, and it's not working. And we went ahead and we started shooting. The blocking was very static. It was going to be a two-shot for the whole scene, shot, reverse shot. And Paul pulled me aside and Jim Deneau, and they said, you got to rethink the blocking of this. And we spent 45 minutes improvising and working through things with the guys. And then there was a point at which they said, okay, it's not working. These improvs aren't working. They're not leading anywhere. Let's just go back to whatever we're going to do. And I was like, no, you can't do that to me. You can't open up a can of worms and then pull out the rug from underneath me. And fortunately, we got to a blocking that worked, and I think worked really well, and had a great shooting day. And of course, the tension of the scene, the moment that was there intuitively, but I didn't even really feel until I screened it in a rough cut form, was that obviously when he unzips the bag to pull out the cash, you're expecting a gun. And a lot of people are sure that Maria's going to get blown away. And a lot of Colombians had this question of, would they let them off that easily? And wouldn't they just shoot them? And again, what I'm trying to do is recreate the stereotype that's been given to us by shows like Miami Vice, that these guys are trapped in it the same way that Maria and Blanca are. These are just young guys. And they were probably shitting bricks the whole time that Maria and Blanca were gone, because they also have someone to report to.
Ella merece un entierro digno. Además, después de todo lo que ustedes le hicieron, es su responsabilidad.
Que va ni mierda, nosotros no tenemos nada que ver con eso. Ya sabía algo que se metía con nosotros, no es nuestra responsabilidad.
One of the other things that I'm interested in is this idea that if Maria and Blanca go back to Colombia, they're stuck in it now. They've been trained, and they're going to have to go back and continue doing this. And that's what indeed happens. People get stuck. People tell me stories of, one of the things that you get when you do a job as a drug mule is a cell phone. And when you get back to your old life, the cell phone keeps ringing. And the person on the other end of the line isn't saying you need to do this job. It's actually a little subtler than that. It's, so how's the money holding out? Do you need anything? Can we give you a little bit of help? And that's how people get sucked into doing it over and over again until they eventually either get caught or die.
1 minute, please. Yo voy a salir un minutico y ya regreso.
There was another funeral home that I wanted to shoot in, which Orlando Tabone has used many, many times to send bodies back. I visited the place, but I couldn't use his name because he said that he's sent back so many bodies, and they've been so good about sort of advancing the money that he now owes them a significant amount of money. So we found this other funeral home, which worked really well. And, it was quite a bit of conversation about what Carla should say here. And I was rewriting it up until the night before we shot it. And I came up with 2 different variations, and we shot the other variation that you're not seeing first. And it was okay, but it wasn't great. And I remember Paul Mazzei turned to me and said, I was like, it's not good. It's not good enough, right? It's not right. And he said, no, it's like an A-. And I was like, I don't want an A-. And then we did the other version of this dialogue where Carla says, we grew so far apart. I can't believe she didn't tell me. And Patricia Ray just nailed it, and it was so intensely moving. I remember Carrie Fix, the first AD, who doesn't speak very much Spanish and didn't really understand the lines because I'd written them the night before and we didn't have the translation handy, said that she was brought to tears while we were shooting, not even knowing what Patricia was saying. I love this scene. I love how quiet it is. Coming up is one of my favorite edits in the film, and it is a nothing cut that you will otherwise miss, and it is this next cut right here, which Lee Percy did. You know, we otherwise would have cut back to Maria in the funeral parlor, and then cut to Maria sitting in the taxi, and then this POV of New York, and it was like cutting to her in the taxi was just that little small step forward. The look on her face in the taxi is the emotional response to what's just taken place between her and Carla, and it allowed the story to advance that much quicker. And it was just one of these subtle but very important editing lessons that I learned from Lee, who was a phenomenal editor to work with. Now we're back in the airport again. Of course, we shot this airport footage at the same time that we shot the baggage claim stuff. We had a very little bit of time, and everyone was exhausted because we had been shooting all night. We had just shot the baggage claim stuff before this. And there were lines in that little portion that we just passed in the lounge, and then there was originally more dialogue here. She said, "Blanca, wait, I can't leave," or something like that. And all the dialogue left in the edit. You know, we got to the edit room, and it was just all in the looks. And I was really concerned about whether it was really believable that Blanca would just sort of turn and leave. But the fact of the matter is, everyone at this point just wants Blanca to go. The feeling is just right. And this shot, which I knew was going to be the final shot of the film, was really difficult to shoot. It was very low light, handheld, Jim Deneau walking backwards. And I'm telling Catalina, because she's so exhausted, I'm giving her very exterior directions, you know, look down, then look up, you know, into midpoint, and then look off into the distance. And she managed to translate that and find it internally. But we almost didn't do a fifth take because we were about to get kicked out of the airport. And I insisted that I didn't quite think I had it. And we did one more take and got this performance. To me, it was the last look that I needed to end the film on. The film, after it was finished, premiered at Sundance, and we were in competition. We were the first Spanish language film to be accepted into dramatic competition, and it was a huge thrill. We had everyone there. We had a lot of people up from Colombia. We had the whole cast. And the best part about screening at Sundance was having all of these people coming up to these actresses, Catalina and Jenny, and all these girls who had never acted before in their life, saying, "Oh my God, you were in that film, I recognized you, that was so great, you were so wonderful," asking Jenny for her autograph, and she had never signed an autograph before, she was still printing her name. And it was the next step to see them responding to all of this attention. It was so great to see people actually respond to the film. And when the film won the audience award, it was just this huge shock, because normally it would be a comedy that would win the audience award. And then we went on to Berlin, and Catalina won Best Actress, and the film got the Best First Film Award. And again, it was just this amazing thing to see Catalina recognized. But one of the most interesting things as far as the reception of the film is that it premiered in Colombia theatrically before the US, and has gotten a lot of really good response there. The First Lady, the wife of the President of Colombia, had a screening in the presidential palace and loved the film so much that she demanded a second and then a third screening, and invited all of these important political people in Colombia. The United Nations requested a print of it so that they could use it for their educational needs. And about 6 weeks after we opened, Orlando Tabone, in his little travel agency in Queens, got a call out of the blue from a 17-year-old guy who was in Colombia and said, "I've been searching for your number. I got it from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm so glad to finally track you down." I was supposed to be a drug mule, and 2 days before I was scheduled to leave, I saw Maria Full of Grace, and it changed my life. And he said that he pulled out of being a drug mule and had since seen the film 3 times, and that he and his father were trying to figure out how to get the money together to pay back the money he had been advanced. And that story was just so meaningful for everyone who worked on the film, because beyond making a really strong, entertaining, gut-wrenching film, the goal, as I had said, was to make some film that was also about some corner of the drug war and the effects of the drug war and what it does to people. And to have people in the United States and elsewhere who are using drugs understand when they're consuming drugs that doesn't end there, that it has this repercussion, and that people's lives are ruined as a result of it, and there's a whole economy in Colombia that's dependent on it. And you know, the most you can ever hope for as a filmmaker is to move people and have people respond to the film emotionally and to remember it and to then have it resonate in such a way that it creates some sort of effect and makes some change in the world. And I hope that's what we've achieved with the film. And I just think it's very important as a filmmaker to look outward and to make films that are not only entertaining but have a relevance for the world that we live in. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this commentary.